what is very telling is that most of these big thinkers, thinkers who are thinking in terms of grand narrative of what Searle has been calling framework questions, where you ask one question and have to answer like 24 other questions which are relevant to answering the single question. Most of these big thinkers have a few authors they know really well, like half a dozen authors they have. Like Jordan Peterson has spent a lot of time studying Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. So they spent not only time on studying specific topics, but they have a few authors that are that have high impact on their own philosophical system, and this is very typical. So I would also on this unifying page cover authors that are relevant to the bigger picture. I think it's important to study an author in their totality. This is to read everything they have written in order to understand their basic metaphorical system, their basic structure of thought. All thought is metaphorical. This is some of the authors that have been quoted in the intellectual dark web, like Jonathan Haidt and Mark Johnson and George Lake have pointed this out, that thinking at the core is metaphorical. And if you really truly want to understand someone, you have to understand their metaphors, how they're using their metaphors. Most of the misunderstanding between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, in my opinion, stems from them using metaphors, different metaphors, and using terms in different ways. Sam Harris, for example, uses science in a much wider way than Peterson does. He uses it as to include the hermeneutic approaches. Or when he speaks of facts, he's of course including facts about consciousness. This is facts about first person reality. Jordan Peterson, initially at least, wasn't aware of this, and he was assuming that whenever Sam was speaking about science, what he had in mind is some kind of narrow monological approach where you're looking at the world, not really engaging with the world, not really talking to the world. I mean, the classically scientific approach is like this. It's not speaking to the object that is to be investigated, but it's just looking at the object that is to be investigated. And then, of course, if you want to deduce an ought from such a monological scientific endeavor, it seems to be very difficult. This is why he accused Sam of falling prey to the naturalistic fallacy, where you deduce an ought from an is. But of course, the kind of is that Sam is describing is already including values. It's already including consciousness as a fact, and that's why he's not really smuggling in something into the picture. He, from the start, has introduced consciousness as an intrinsic part of the picture. This is just one example of where I think in the end they would basically agree. If you were to break it down into single questions and how they think about these questions, they would basically agree on most of these, but they seem to disagree just because they're simply using very different metaphorical systems to develop their metaphysics and their general thought. So we need to also study authors in their entirety to get a full grasp on their metaphorical, most foundational concepts. And in doing this, by the way, this is a classically hermeneutical approach where you take the whole in order to understand the part, and you need the parts to understand the whole, and you're always jumping back and forth between the parts, which is the individual statements, and the whole, which is the entirety of their worldview. Taking this approach, you can understand even the most difficult authors to read, like people like Heidegger, are actually pretty easy to understand if you look at the entirety of their work, if you read it in the original language, and if you start out with their first published materials and go through all of it, it becomes pretty easy to understand them because you learn their language. And once you've done that, you can then come back and break it down into something that is comprehensible in a everyday language, comprehensible to all, and show where the implications of their thought lie for every one of us, everyone who is part of the larger community. So I would also focus on studying thinkers. This is crucially important because some thinkers simply cannot be understood unless you study their entire oeuvre.